pretty much killed me to go over all this stuff in this shorter time. So good luck, is what I'm saying. So evolution, as you've already studied about natural selection, which is found at the bottom of this chart, it turns out there's natural selection is the main drive of evolution, and as Darwin specified, he preferred um, her- hereditary changes with modification over the word evolution. But there are other factors, and one, they're all on this list. So, and these all affect the evolutionary change, and it's called, doesn't matter what it's called. So, mutation is a big one. Mutation randomly introduces new alleles into a population. That's probably one of the biggest things because that's when you can grow a third eye in your head. It's not always a good mutation, it's not always a bad mutation, it's not always a neutral mutation, and whatever it is, if it happens to suit the environment, it'll take hold. Gene flow, also sort of known as migration. Okay, so usually it's caused by one group. Well, let's go back to mutation. Random changes in DNA. The more genetic difference in the gene pool, the more species will have selective advantage. So that means it makes sense if there's more diversification in the randomization of the gene pool, there's more likely that you will grow a third eye in your head. For instance, because of this, the Norway rat, which had a large population, was introduced to a poison called warfarin poison, and it had enough diversity in its gene pool that a certain group were immune to that poison. They, of course, survived, reproduced, and soon all Norway rats were immune to warfarin poison. Mutation. Gene flow usually means causing one group of a population mating with another group of a population. So again, if you have a group of caribou living over here, and a group of caribou living over here, and just one caribou happens to run too far over here and mates with a caribou over here, well, he's introducing new genes that all come from over there. Same if they both happen to do it. Now, this gene pool will get all the benefits of this gene pool, and same with this gene pool, we'll get all the benefits of that gene pool. And that's called gene flow. So it's essentially what migration. For example, the gray wolves, so the one shown in figure 9, have large territories. A lone wolf, gray wolf, may have traveled over 800 kilometers in search of a new territory or breeding partner. And that's because they kept breeding with the new populations. Non-random mating, and then its preferred phenotype. So that is when like a peacock shows his feathers. So it's non-random mating. It's when the female of the species makes a non-random choice to choose her mate. So non-random mating is mating among individuals on the basis of mate selection for a particular phenotype. For instance, female peahens pick the peacock with the nicest feathers. In time, they learned that peacocks with the nicest feathers usually were healthy, which is why peahens were picking them. However, this genetic thing that got passed on was based on the peahen's selection. So it's a good example of genetic, natural selection aside, she picked the guy she liked the most. Songs. Birds make songs. It's a behavioral modification. Nest making. Some birds dance around. There's all sorts of behaviors that impact on future generations when the female of the species picks her mate. Then there's non-random mating inbreeding. That's when some plants don't need other plants to fertilize. They self-fertilize. But the problem with this is their gene pool doesn't really grow, and you can get more mutation. If you do it in mammals, for instance, if you have sex with your sister and have a baby, you will most likely cause a disease because the recessive genes come up more likely, and those recessive genes become dominant. So the offsprings will all have genetic problems. So but however, that does take place. There is inbreeding when it's necessary. Genetic drift. So this tends to have a bigger impact on small populations. So, for instance, if there's 20 birds as opposed to 20,000 birds, the genetics drift will occur more randomly, and it's usually linked to, okay, so randomly alleles reproduce. You can sometimes lose entire alleles just by random chance that only a small selection reproduce. So if you have a population of 10 flowers, right? So you have a population of 10, let's say 10 wolves, right? Boom, 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 10 wolves, boom, boom. Boom. And just by chance, the only two wolves that mate with each other are these two. Just by chance. These two were unsuccessful. This guy got injured, whatever. All of the gene pool that exists in their new wolf population comes from these two. So if there was a recessive white gene in here, you will no longer have white wolves. If there was a recessive long tooth gene over here, you will no longer have long tooth. But it was just because in this small group, these two mated, and the only genes that carried on in the gene pool is defined as all the possible genes in a population. The gene pool got narrowed. They lost all these wolves over here, and the gene pool got smaller. There's several things that can cause genetic drift. Another one of them is called the founder effect, and the founder effect is similar to that wolf we just did. So if you have suddenly an area with a bunch of wolves, and it's limited food, and one wolf just in a dying moment just walks as far as he can this way because he knows he's not going to live back here, and he happens to find his way through a forest to a Shangri-La with lots of food, and he brought with him, 3 females, and so he reproduces, and there's more wolves here and more food, and they populate well. But as generations go on, the generations from this wolf group will randomly be different than the random changes from this group. So if you go down far enough generations, these wolves might have big ears with long teeth because everything's tough to break into. These wolves might have great big mouths because there's so much food or whatever. But eventually they'll come from the same genetics. They have the same ancestor, but they will split off. So that's called founder effect, as in they found a new place to live. The bottleneck effect is a lot like a disaster. So let's say you have a whole bunch of groups, but let's say you got a bunch of trees over here. Nice forest, and that's a bad example of a forest. Nice forest growing here, and just 2 trees happen to come over here. And boom, a meteor comes out of the sky and wipes out all that forest. And these just happen to be the only genes that get passed on to the next generation. They lost all these genes in the gene pool, and all future generations will rely upon these 2 trees. So all future trees come from those, not those. So that was a disaster. This is called the bottleneck. And the reason it's called the bottleneck effect is because they look at it like this way. Here's a bottle, and in that bottle is every type of that creature. So if we're talking about chimpanzees, every chimpanzee in that area. And only 2 chimpanzees managed to be shaken out of the bottle to survive. The rest got destroyed in the natural event. So that's why they call it the bottleneck. It's just a way of remembering it. But when you fully shake that bottle, only a few genetics fall out. It's random which ones. You don't know which ones carry on. Natural selection. So we've gone over natural selection. We finally got to it. So we've seen that there's other things that influence evolution. Mutation, gene flow, non-random mating. So that's when the preferred phenotypes. That's when the female gets to choose her mate. So genetics has, environment has nothing to do with it. And then there's non-random inbreeding. Then there's genetic drift, the bottleneck effect, and the founder effect. That's when just a few genes from a big population happen to get passed on. Now we've reached natural selection, which you know. But even within natural selection, there's things that can happen. There's the stabilizing selection, directional selection, disruptive selection. You're going to have to know these terms. Stabilizing, directional, selection. So, stabilizing. Stabilizing selection favors an intermediate phenotype, so a middle group. So if this is body size, the middle body size tends to survive. So let's say the food is found in holes that are too small, and the creatures in those holes are too big, so the little guys die if they go in, the big guys can't get in, and only the middle body types can get in and fight the creatures. So that's a stabilizing natural selection. The most common phenotype, the intermediate form, is made more common in the population by removing the extremes. That makes this type of selection means it reduces variation and improves the adaptation of the population to aspects of that environment. So in that case, the little caves with the little holes, this middle group becomes the dominant. So this brown is what survives up here, and then this brown is what becomes the new population curve. You see that? Curve. The next group is a directional selection. This is when you have an entire end of a population. These bell curves represent the average, the middle being the most dominant type of creatures, but there's always extremes. So in this case, it's body size. So there's always tiny creatures, big creatures, but most creatures fall in the middle. In this case, for whatever reason, the big creatures survived. So maybe there was a predator that was very big, and only the big creatures could fend it off. But for whatever case, the middle creature, medium-sized creatures, and the small creatures got eaten off, and the new variation down below, this new variation, the average, is now much bigger. The body type average is much bigger. The offspring will be much bigger. They'll still be small, and they'll still be big, but the small is much bigger than the small used to be, and the big is much bigger than the biggest used to be. So that's a directional selection. It usually shifts one way or the other. A good example was on those birds, finches, that needed bigger beaks to break the seeds. So the dominant species shifted to the right in terms of beak size. Directional selection favors the phenotype of one extreme over the other. You might see this in the environmental change. For instance, for a breed of finches on one island, there was a drought. The population was decimated. Those that survived had bigger beaks to crack tougher seeds. So the beak size drifted to the right, and then the average became larger beak size. Or the peppered moth during pollution. The moth color shifted to the right to black, or antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Then you have natural selection, disruptive selection. So the middle gets disruptive. For so whatever reason, this group, the big body size here, survives more, and this little group survives more. So again, maybe the medium size is perfect prey size for a giant golden eagle predator. And the golden eagle predator doesn't want to attack the small guys because it's not enough food, doesn't want to attack the big guys because he can't win, takes out the middle group. Then you get this average split in the population that tends to look like this now. The offspring tend not to be medium-sized. They tend to either be small or big. And then you get this weird curve going on. This can happen, called diversifying selection, also, as well as disruptive selection. It takes place when the extremes of a range of a phenotype are favored over intermediate phenotypes. An example would be the male coho salmon. The smaller phenotype survived, and the bigger ones survived. That's because the bigger ones were more aggressive and could get the females they wanted, and the small ones would sneak in and fertilize the eggs. The middle Soho salmon would die out. Natural selection, final aspect of natural selection, sexual selection, is when females choose their mates based on visual selection or through combat. So there's a natural selection, that's sexual selection. It's sort of covered also in that other one. But here, these are things you have to memorize. So this chart, these are the 5 big influences on evolution. Mutation, gene flow, so that when creatures migrate and change the population gene pool. Non-random mating, so when females choose their mates through the color of their feathers or through inbreeding. Genetic drift, so we see that when there's a natural disaster, or when one of a creature wanders a long distance and founds on a new island. You see that a lot on islands. So birds happen to land on an island after a long flight and they reproduce there. Then their whole genetics change compared to where they came from. It's also created by, that's the founder effect, a new island. And then the bottleneck effect is when a disaster strikes, a natural disaster. And then there's natural selection, which is the predominant evolution strain. Within that, you have to memorize within the natural selection that there's stabilizing selection that tends to increase the average in the middle. A directional selection that could shift left or right. It doesn't matter, left or right, doesn't matter which way. But for whatever reason, this type of creature is favored. It could be beak length, it could be body size, whatever. And it tends to then make the average much higher. Then in this case, you get a disruptive selection, so it's totally disruptive down the middle, and you get this weird average in the next generation. And it affects all future generations. So you need to know that. So, next one, speciation. Very important. Speciation. A species consists of reproductively compatible population. And speciation is the formation of a new species from previously existing species. So, you get all sorts of different types. So speciation, the definition, the creation of a new species from a common ancestor through the course of evolution. You get sympatric speciation. This is speciation in which populations within the same geographical area diverge and become reproductively isolated. And I'm afraid you have to memorize this. Sympatric speciation. It happens in plants often, but an animal example is the western and eastern meadowlark. They look almost identical, but they do not breed together. They have different songs, so they don't breed together at all. So they hang out, they never reproduce. It's sympatric speciation. 2 different species from the same ancestor, but they never mix. You can also get offspring from certain animals, but they become infertile. it can produce asexually, result in the formation of separate population. Allopatric speciation occurs when a population is split into two or more isolated groups by a geographical barrier. So again, this would be, they came from the same group. Some of them crossed the river when it was frozen. The river thawed and never froze again. They were separated by this land divide, and their species evolved separately and produced new species. Darwin found this with finches on the islands of Galapagos. There was all sorts of different species because they'd all got trapped on different islands. Adaptive radiation. The speciation of finches throughout the Galapagos is adaptive radiation. It is a form of allopatric speciation that we just covered, so the islands. Is the diversification of a common ancestral species into a variety of differently adapted species, so adaptive radiation. So they all came from one, but you see these branches off of all different types. Volcanic Hawaiian Islands have a great example of that. The group of islands is about 3,500 kilometers of little tiny islands, and the islands vary in age, and when the islands first formed, they had no life. And over time, they were populated by species that happened to travel by the currents or the winds, on the water, whatever flew. And each island had physical different characteristics with different food options. And so you saw this explosion of different species on the animals that all come from the same ancestor but became very different species. For example, the Hawaiian honey creepers, or members of the finch family, are found only in Hawaii. And about 28 species of honey creepers are believed to have evolved from one ancestor that crossed the ocean. So their major episodes of adaptive radiation often occur after the evolution of a novel characteristic. For example, the evolution of limbs in vertebrates and wings in insects open up new possibilities for habitat and food supplies. So the first creatures who got wings or were able to had vertebrates, had spines, had a big advantage. Insect wings resulted in the evolution of hundreds of thousands of variations on the basic insect body, making this group the most successful and widespread type of animal on Earth. Which is true. There are way more, about 1 million times as many insects as human beings. They are the dominant creature on the planet. Insects are far more numerous than human beings and survive far more readily. There are also reproductive isolating mechanisms. So here's a bummer. It's another chart to memorize. So reproductive isolating mechanisms, prezygotic, which means before fertilization, and postzygotic, during fertilization. So you get things that prevent mating, and you get things that prevent fertilization. So they might get together, but they don't mate properly, or they might get together and mate, but there's no egg that's produced. So you get behavioral isolation, temporal isolation, and ecological isolation. Behavioral isolation is something they do. A good example of that is songs. Songs by one finch don't attract another finch. The western, what was that bird called? Could not attract the other one because they had different songs, so they would never mate. They were never attracted to each other. Temporal isolation. So the temporal means time, so not time traveling, but it just so happens that you have a flower that blooms at a certain time of the year, a certain time of the day, that's identical ancestor as another, like there's 3 types of orchids that flower at different times, so they never breed, they never share their pollen. Then you get ecological habitat isolation. And a good example of that is 2 similar species separated by habitat. So example, the garter snake is an example. The northwest garter snake prefers open areas such as meadows and rarely enters water. And the common garter snake, on the other hand, prefers water. So because this garter snake is hanging out near water and this other garter snake is hanging out in meadows, they never meet and they never mate. Let's look at things that where they breed, prevention of fertilization. So they try to breed, but they don't succeed. So species that are closely related may attempt to mate but fail to achieve fertilization, so they don't fertilize the egg. For example, the genitals of some insects operate in a kind of lock and key system. If a male and female of different species attempt to breed, their genitals will not fit together properly, and therefore no egg ever gets produced. That's a mechanical isolation. Then there's gametic isolation, so they do succeed in sharing sperm or pollen. Sometimes they do breed and sperm or pollen is exchanged, but it can't survive in that environment or else never reaches the egg. In plants, pollen grains of one species typically fail to germinate on the stigma of another species, so fertilization is prevented. So these are all things that keep the different species from ever crossing over again. Then you get ones over here on the right, post-zygotic, which means the egg has been fertilized. but there's all sorts of things that prevent it from carrying on past that. Zygotic mortality, so I think it means it'll die before it ever is born. Hybrid invisibility, we'll get to, and hybrid infertility. So you can breed a burro, I think it's a donkey and a horse, and you get a burro, but it's infertile, it can never carry on. So let's try genetic incompatibility for zygotic mortality is a species that may develop of the hybrid zygote during its development. For example, hybrid embryos become sheep and goats. So when sheep and goats breed, they die in early development before birth. So they do create a fertilized egg, but the creature never is born because it doesn't have enough in common. Then there's hybrid inviability, not invisibility. Inviability. Sometimes two species can mate and produce hybrid offspring. A familiar example is a mule, which the offspring is a horse and a donkey. Okay, so this is it. So a horse and a donkey have a baby, it's a mule. However, reproductive barrier still exists between the two species as the hybrid is sterile, so the mule can never have a child. If meiosis fails to prevent normal hybrids in the hybrid, this barrier may become into effect. So hybrid infertility, in some cases the first generation hybrids of cross species are viable and fertile. However, when these hybrids mate with each other, the individual forms something that is sterile or weak, so it never survives. The species never survives. For example, different species of cotton plants can produce fertile hybrids, but the offspring of that fertile hybrid dies as soon as it's born, so the gene never carries on. There is things called divergent and convergent evolution. So they often wondered, why the hell are these suddenly layers of fossils? Seems to be an explosion of creatures, and then nothing. So divergent evolution is a pattern of evolution in which species that were once similar to an ancestor species diverge or become increasingly distinct. So for instance, mankind had two different types of mankind, probably 3 or 4, all living at the same time, and only one carried through to become us. Divergent evolution occurs when population change as they adapt to different environmental conditions. So for instance, we had to either develop tools or weapons more quickly, or we had an environment that was more hostile, we had to smarten up fast, whatever. But the populations became less and less alike as they adapt, and eventually resulting in two different species. However, they came from the same ancestor. Then there's convergent evolution. In contrast, in some instances, two unrelated species share the similar traits. For example, both birds and bees have wings, yet they have different ancestors. So this gets onto that term that we're coming to later about analogous shapes, functions. And in convergent evolution, similar traits arrive because each species has independently adapted to similar environmental conditions, but not because they share a common ancestor. So birds and bats evolved independently, but at the same time. So it's convergent evolution. It happened at the same time, but they came up with different wings. Yet natural selection favored variation suitable for that same environment, which was the air. So both the birds and the bats did better because the air was where it was at the time. Since they do not share a common ancestor, however, birds and bats evolved quite different wings. So that's convergent evolution in which wings evolved from two very different creatures because of one environmental need, the air. Then you had gradualism. Now gradualism supported that everything happened so gradually. Since Darwin's time, evolutionary biologists have supported the model of gradualism, which views evolutionary change as very slow, very steady, before and after a divergence, which is up here where we had that split of two creatures. But according to this model, big changes occur by the accumulation of many small changes. Yet the fossil record rarely reveals this show and gradual transition. Instead, we used to discover fossils like of massive change and massive transitions, and they couldn't understand how that fit into the whole gradualism concept of evolution that takes its time and slowly changes things. And then in 1972, a guy named Niles Eldredge of the American Museum of Natural History and Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard University suggested an alternative model still fits within gradualism, but they said once in a while gradualism has punctuated equilibrium. According to this model, evolutionary history consists of long periods of stasis, of gradualism, or equilibrium, so still gradualism, just equilibrium, everything's balanced, that are suddenly punctuated, suddenly interrupted by periods of divergence. So suddenly there's a man who can stand erect, and he's crushing all the skulls of all the other apes, and suddenly you see this man's bones everywhere because he wiped out everything. Most species undergo much of their morphological change, so that's just shape change, when they first diverge from the parent species. After that, they change relatively little. So when we first stood erect or lost our tail or developed our opposing thumb would be a better one, we probably dominated everything, and then we changed very little after that because we didn't need to change after that. After that, they change relatively little, even as this gives rise to other species. Given this model, the fossil record would consist mostly of fossils from long periods of time when little or no change occurred, with only a few fossils from periods of rapid change. It is now accepted that both models of evolutionary change are at work: gradualism, punctuated equilibrium. So most things are gradual, and then suddenly you have a big, evolutionary change. Keep in mind this is usually caused by divergent evolution, when suddenly within a bunch of ape species, for instance, we pop out with our opposing thumbs and we dominate everything. We survive better. As opposed to convergent evolution, where a bird and a bee both develop wings at the same time, in the same period of time, for the same need, because all the food is in the air, but they did not stem from any same source. So then you have to go back and you're going to have to memorize this chart, which goes into detail about all the things I just described. Reproductive isolating mechanisms that are pre-fertilization and after fertilization. And there's prevention of mating, so behavior, singing, or behavior by the birds that don't attract other birds. Temporal isolation, in which they don't ever have the same opportunity to breed in time. Ecological habitat isolation, so one hangs out near water, one hangs out near grass. Then prevention of fertilization, even if they do meet, their tools don't fit, penis doesn't fit in a certain whatever, and doesn't work there. Or even if you get the sperm in there, for some reason it never fertilizes or gets to the birth point. And then there's post-birth, where it does fertilize, but something happens. For instance, zygotic mortality, it just dies, never reaches it. Hybrid inviability, so a donkey and a horse breed to create a mule, but nothing else happens to that. Or hybrid infertility, in which the species does breed, but the next generation dies off. So then you also have to then remember, this is the tough one, speciation, the creation of new species from a common ancestor. And you have to look at sympatric speciation and allopatric. So sympatric speciation is speciation in which population within the same geographical areas diverge and become reproductively isolated. And allopatric speciation is when the population is split into two or more isolated groups by geographical barriers. That's tough stuff to remember.